and for my presentation, I'm going to be talking about one of the most interesting and debated topics between sports fans and analysts alike. Who is the greatest basketball player of all time? Over the course of NBA history, there's been a number of talents that have stood out above the rest. There's a handful of names that could each have a valid claim to this title, but for the sake of time and being able to do a thorough analysis, today we're just going to look at who most people have as their consensus top two. Let's take a closer look at these two legends. As much as this guy needs no introduction, here's a quick overview. Drafted third out of North Carolina in 1984, Michael Jordan had one of the greatest careers of any athlete ever, period. Capped off by his two three-peat championship runs with the Chicago Bulls in the 90s. Just a few of his accolades include being a 5-time MVP, 6-time Finals MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, and 10-time scoring champ. And that's just to name a few. I could keep going on like that all day. MJ was one of the defining cultural icons of the 1990s, and his play on the court always backed it up. Now, his competition's no slouch either. LeBron was the most highly anticipated athlete of my lifetime before coming into the league, and somehow he's still managed to exceed expectations at pretty much every turn. A kid out of Akron, Ohio, LeBron was drafted to his hometown Cleveland Cavs before taking his talents to South Beach and teaming up with Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh to win a couple of rings there. After that, he returned home to Cleveland to take down the 73-9 Golden State Warriors and complete the only 3-1 comeback in NBA Finals history. Today, he plays for the Lakers and hopes to bring them home another title. To top it all off, the King is a 4-time MVP as well as a 3-time NBA Finals MVP. So, how do we define greatness? Well, everyone has a different way of looking at the debate, but for me, it's easiest to break it down into three distinct categories: offense, defense, and winning. All of the data that I got from my analysis is taken from basketballreference.com. Basketball Reference offers a number of interesting data sets for each player that gives an analyst quite a few options to play around with. For my analysis and calculations, the data sets that I focused on were traditional per game stats, stats per 100 possessions, and advanced statistics. Now, if I were comparing two players from today's era, there's even more detailed and interesting stats that you can get into, such as shooting stats by distance and play-by-play data, but unfortunately that information is not available for MJ's era. After selecting my data sets, I had to tidy the data so it'd be organized and ready to work with. Data from Basketball Reference transfers over fairly well to Excel, so there wasn't too much dirty work, but I still had to make a few changes regardless. The first thing that I wanted to do was exclude seasons where players were injured, so that the data would not be skewed in that way. Jordan played just 18 games in the 1985-86 season after breaking his foot, and just 17 in the 1994-95 season after his return from his stint in minor league baseball, so I removed both of those seasons. LeBron, however, did not have any seasons with less than 55 games, which is enough for a qualifying season, so I didn't remove any from his totals. Interestingly enough, outside of those two shortened seasons and his time with the Wizards, MJ averaged just over 81 out of the possible 82 games played per season, while LeBron averaged a steady 74. For the sake of our discussion, I also removed Jordan's tenure with the Wizards after he had been retired for 3 years, because it was well after his prime, and LeBron is still playing, and most people would say that he's still in his prime right now, so we're not able to account for how he may decline from here on out. And although this may seem unfair at a glance, I think that when you're looking specifically at the GOAT debate, nobody ever talks about MJ's time on the Wizards, and it's a mostly irrelevant part of his legacy. These days, there's a ton of offensive stats out there, so it can be hard to know which ones are most accurate to help you evaluate a player. Here's some of the principles that I followed to decide what to use. Counting stats like points, assists, and rebounds are the foundation for understanding the game of basketball. These are great, but they don't mean very much without context. One concept that's really important when analyzing a basketball player's skill level is efficiency. Efficiency is what explains why a guy who can score 20 points on 10 shots is much more valuable than having someone who can score 25 points per game putting up 20 shots. To measure efficiency, one thing that we can look at is percentages, like true shooting percentage. True shooting percentage weighs 3-point, 2-point, and free throw attempts to create an equation that more accurately describes a player's overall shooting ability than any of the individual percentages could do on their own. Of course, there are limitations to advanced stats like true shooting percentage, but they're generally able to give a more accurate depiction of a player's skills and value. Another thing we can look at is tempo-free stats like assist percentage or averages per 100 possessions. The idea behind doing that is that someone scoring 50 points per game today, for example, is much more difficult than in the 1960s when Wilt Chamberlain did it, not only because the level of competition is different, of course, but because of the pace of play. Looking at per 100 possession and percentage-based stats for both of these players allows us to account for pace of play and potential differences in era. Here's a head-to-head breakdown of a few of my favorite stats that I analyzed for Michael and LeBron. These numbers are averages for their careers, regular season on top, and playoff in the chart on the bottom. We have points per 100 possessions, true shooting percentage, and assist-to-turnover ratio. Points per 100 possessions coupled with true shooting percentage shows us the player's ability to score the basketball in both volume and efficiency. We see that for points per 100 possessions, Michael has a strong lead on LeBron, while LeBron has the slight edge in efficiency. What we can deduce from this is that Michael had to carry a bigger scoring load on his teams, and this is also confirmed from him having a higher usage percentage of around 36% compared to LeBron's 33%. Both are extremely efficient players, but we can see that LeBron has a slight edge here for both regular season and playoffs. Now, I also wanted to look at assist-to-turnover ratio. This shows us both a player's ability to set teammates up for success and the ability to take care of the ball. We see that LeBron has a moderate lead over Michael here. So, through both of these, we can confirm that what most people would agree with, that LeBron is generally a better facilitator than MJ, but MJ, putting up much better scoring numbers on very similar efficiency rates, is a more dynamic scorer than LeBron. Defensive stats, however, are a bit tougher to come by. Defense is a team game, but there are still standout individual defensive players, of course. Many defensive stats, however, can be influenced by the teammates that a player has around them. In addition to that, the counting stats we have for defense are also flawed. Steals and blocks do little to tell you how well a player can effectively guard these positions. A player's steal or block numbers can become inflated by gambling on defense and going for more turnovers rather than playing a good job guarding your man, which oftentimes leads to getting beat on defense and getting scored on, which better defenders would avoid doing. With that being said, defensive stats do still have merit and can be quite useful, especially when coupled with game film. When comparing head-to-head, I thought that percentage stats would be a good way to fairly evaluate these players' performance. Steal percentage, or block percentage for that matter, is the percentage of times a player would get a steal for every 100 possessions that the ball comes down the court. This adjusts for pace and makes it a fairer comparison between Mike and LeBron. Defensive rating is an advanced stat that shows how many points a player allows due to their own defensive lapses per 100 possessions, which tries to take team defense out of the equation. Do note that due to this, a lower defensive rating is preferred, because that means that you're allowing less points. So, by looking at these charts, we see that MJ has a substantial lead in steals percentage, LeBron has a moderate lead in blocks percentage, and we got different results for both regular season and playoff defensive rating. I have to say, this part came as a surprise to me. MJ is regarded across the board as a great defender, and LeBron's defense is often critiqued as one of the weaknesses of his game. We see here that the critics may have been too harsh on LeBron in the past. Another thing that I thought was interesting from this analysis is that LeBron's D rating in the playoffs is significantly better than his in the regular season, and MJ's is the opposite. This goes to show that LeBron really can turn his defensive efforts on and off when he wants to, and when his defense is on, he's without a doubt a lockdown defender. Now, I'm sure when you heard me mention winning as one of my categories, you probably assumed I was just going to say something about Jordan's 6 rings, 72-10 Bulls team, and call it a day. Of course, that matters in the GOAT debate, but I think we can come up with something a little fresher than the old rings argument. I wanted to look at a couple of advanced stats that show not how many wins you have, but how many wins you contribute to personally. To do that, I researched box plus minus and win shares per 48. For those of you who are NBA fans, I'm sure you've heard of the traditional plus minus stat, which basically shows how many points your team led or trailed by when you were on the floor. Box plus minus is an advanced adaptation of the stat that estimates the amount of points per 100 possessions that a player contributes to their team, compared to a league average player. This estimates a player's overall contribution to winning when they're on the court. Another advanced stat that I like to look at is win shares per 48. This is another stat that it's rather complicated to calculate, but it does a nice job taking a player's offensive and defensive efficiency and showing how they impact winning for their team. The 48 is in reference to 48 minutes, or the length of a basketball game, so this allows you to see exactly how much they contribute on a per-game basis. Additionally, these are both rate stats, which means that they don't depend on pace or playing time, so they create a more level playing field than a stat like VORP, which is value over replacement player, that takes every game into account to give you a full season total. These are on possession or single game basis. Looking at the two players head to head, we see that MJ dominates the regular season in both categories, but LeBron turns it up come playoff time and improves his numbers where it counts once again. LeBron improved both numbers in the playoffs, where MJ improved his BPM to an otherworldly level of 11.2, but his win shares did decrease slightly. To give you some context to how dominant these two really are, Basketball Reference states that a season with a BPM in the 8+ range is an MVP caliber season, comparing peak Dirk Nowitzki or Shaq for reference, and we have LeBron averaging nearly 9 and MJ over 10 for their entire careers. So it looks like the analytics here favor Michael, but LeBron is not far behind, putting up some impressive numbers as well. It's not easy to crown a GOAT, and there's never going to be a definitive answer due to people's biases and differing definitions of greatness. But with all these things in mind, personally, I have to give Jordan the slight edge for taking on greater scoring responsibilities at higher efficiency, performing equally well on the defensive end while creating more turnovers, and with his edge in advanced stats and contribution to winning. Now, there's a million different ways to look at this argument that I wish we had more time to delve into, but given the circumstances of this project, there's only so much we can take into account. For what it's worth, I hope you enjoyed what I had to say, and maybe even learned a thing or two in the process. To all my fellow graduating seniors, stay positive. Better things are on the horizon.